All right, good morning, good Erev Shabbos. I want to try something this morning, a little bit different. Through an analysis of one particular halacha, which may or may not be very popular or well known, to try to understand a little bit more about the halachic process. And again, the halachic process is not something that we determine. It's for Chazal and the leaders in each generation determine it. But I want to see how it works out. What I'm referring to is the halacha, what we call pas akum, pat akum, non-Jewish bread. Rosh Hashanah is not too far away. The shul is starting to sell tickets already. And there is a minhag brought down in Shulchan Aruch and elsewhere that during the Aseret Yemei Tshuva, when we try to be on our best behavior, people try to be nizhar, careful about not eating non-Jewish bread. So it's a fascinating area of halacha, because the same way that Chazal prohibited non-Jewish wine, we can't drink wine because it might lead to socialization, which might lead to intermarriage, and obviously we don't want that. The same thing is true about pat akum. Now, we're not talking about commercially produced bread. We'll get to that in a moment. We're talking about your next door neighbor has an oven which is only used for kosher products, let's assume, bread only. And as a gesture of friendship, he gives you a loaf of bread. Or he may be selling bread out of his as a sideline. There is a prohibition against eating pas akum. Pas akum, because the socialization might lead, again, to intermarriage. It diminishes the socialization between the two. This is based on a Gemara in Avodah Zarah. And not only was it just stam a decree against intermarriage, but this was one of the 18 very important celebrated decrees issued together by Hillel and Shammai, which in itself is interesting, but they're considered very stringent and very difficult, if not impossible, to rescind. Once a takana of that stature has been issued, you can't just do away with it. And there's also other decrees about non-Jewish wine and oil. There are certain, now it's interesting, the decree against non-Jewish oil was found to be very, very difficult to abide by, because oil was definitely essential for cooking, otherwise food would burn. And we're talking about vegetable oil, obviously. And eventually this was rescinded by Yehuda Hanassi, who was the head of the Sanhedrin at the time, because he felt that it was exceedingly difficult to adhere to this particular decree. And again, it doesn't mean we could use any oil at all. It has to have a proper hashgacha and so forth and so on. The only, I guess, leniency is that it doesn't require a mashgiach tamidi. If it's yotzi v'nichnas, it's sufficient. Now, there's a lot of discussion among the Rishonim as to whether or not the decree about non-Jewish bread was ever rescinded, because of the difficulty. Bread is a staple of everybody's diet, and therefore, at some point, some Mefarshim feel, including the Talmud Yerushalmi, that it was rescinded. You were allowed to eat what they called pas palter. Pas palter. Pas palter simply means non-Jewish bread baked by a non-Jewish baker, commercial baker. In other words, you can buy a loaf of bread in the supermarket that has an OU that is made by a non-Jewish commercial bakery. That's called pas palter. In days of yore, you had a local baker who was not Jewish, but his products were kosher. So there's no concern about social interaction with a non-Jew if you're buying from a commercial establishment or you're buying in the supermarket bread that has a proper hashgacha. But again, most of the opinions are that it was rescinded only in situations where it was necessary to do so. In other words, they didn't have any other bread to eat. Not everybody. Now, many people in the pre-modern era baked their own bread, but not everybody did. If people were involved in work outside the home, they didn't necessarily have the ability to be home and bake bread. Baking bread takes a while. Roll to dough, and you have to wait till it rises. It's a production. Ask anybody who's made challah, multiply that for your daily bread every single day of the week. That's a very time-consuming process. So paspalter is permitted, but again, there are many people who are still makpid during the Aseret Shemei Tshuva only to purchase and consume Jewish bread. A professional baker is a heter. However, and again, I'm trying to wrap my brain around the process here. Who was it? The father of Rav. Rav was a very famous Amora, Rav and Shmuel. Rav's father was his name was Ibu. I don't know where that comes from. And he was known to eat pasakum, non-Jewish bread. Now, he was a great scholar. Yet, many of the later, you don't find him quoted. Many Amoraim refused to quote him, possibly because a person's stature has something to do with what their halachic observance is. And I guess they felt this was something that was inappropriate. There's another interesting Gemara, and I'm trying to put this all together. It's an anecdote about Yehuda Nasi and his assistant, his Rabbi Simlai. The rabbis rescinded the decree we mentioned about Shemen Akev, non-Jewish oil. And Rav Simlai was not in the base medrash when this cataclysmic event took place. It was a major innovation to rescind an enactment. And they wanted to know if Yehuda Hanasi would also rescind the decree against non-Jewish bread. And he said, that far I'm not going to go, because I don't want to be known as the Bezdin that permitted Pasaku. So what we come up against is another or a related rabbinic dictum. The Gemara says, "Ein gozrim gzeira alat tzibur imena yochal labedbo," that the rabbis may not only should have, but may not issue a decree if the majority of people find it too onerous, too difficult, they can't follow it. So if you can issue decrees, obviously, but they have to be, I guess, something that is possible to do without too much effort or difficulty. And this concept, I guess, is in conflict with the Pasakim, because for many people, that was also a difficulty. And the Rishonim obviously argue about it. The Rambam says this Pasakim is in full effect. It has never been annulled. It's the same way you can't drink non-Jewish wine, you can't eat non-Jewish bread. But he notes that there are some places where they are lenient, not in Pasakum, but Paspalter. No, they won't buy from they won't eat bread baked by their next door neighbor, but they'll go to a commercial bakery and buy non-Jewish bread there. And again, what's the concern? The whole concern for the decree was intermarriage. So if you buy from a commercial bakery, there's no concern about intermarriage, there's no social action there. Tosfos, writing in Ashkenaz, says that it was quite common in France and Germany and in Northern Europe to consume pasakum. And they seem to imply that there was room to annul this particular edict. And the fact that Jews were eating pasakum to them seems to indicate that at one point it was annulled. The prohibition was lifted, even though it is not specifically recorded anywhere in the Talmud Bavli. So again, how do we deal with this in general, in terms of halakhic development, in terms of halakhic structure? Soloveitchik once mentioned that if you see a community doing something for generation upon generation, it obviously must mean that this practice originated in the time of the Gemara. For example, the slichos that we say were organized roughly in the Gaonic period, maybe even later, and people have been saying slichos for generations. So the Rav had to assume that this minhag was so widespread because even in the time of the Gemara, they were saying slichos already. And the Rambam observed that every Jewish community says slichos. So it must have been going on for a very, very long time. Tosfos has a little different take on it, and he says that if Jews do something, that constitutes the equivalent of a Talmudic source. Not that they were doing it from that time period, like the Rav says, but it's the equivalent of it. Because people, especially during the time of the Balei Tosfos, people were on a very high level religiously, and he brings a proof where he says that in shul during the week, especially on Monday and Thursday, they were as packed as they were on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur. Well, that indicates a fairly high level of commitment in that community. Now, again, please don't misunderstand me. I am not implying that bread does not require a proper hashgacha. We definitely have to have that. But nevertheless, we pretty much accept the Rambam's opinion that pas akum is today, even though the decree might still be in effect, people permit it if Pas Yisrael is not available. So today, Pas Yisrael is available, but nevertheless, we accept the leniency of eating Pas Akum as normative. And Rav Moshe may not be happy with it, but he accepts it because Minhag Yisrael has been to do this. Again, there's a lot of debate whether or not Pas Akum was ever annulled officially, but the fact that people were doing it indicates that it may have been. And you have different opinions among the Rishonim concerning Pas Akum, even though the decree still applies, despite the fact that some feel it was rescinded. Nevertheless, the minhag is to follow this leniency. But the key word is it's a leniency. It is still, if you were to ask a halachic shaila, is it permissible to eat non-Jewish bread that is kosher? The answer is yes. Is it preferable? The answer would have to be no. Which is why during Yasser Shemei Tshuva, people have a minhag of being makpid to try to be on their best behavior, so to speak, and not to eat anything that might be questionable, which means only eating Jewish bread on the Yasser Shemei Tshuva as an act of, I guess, religiosity during that period of judgment.
So but it hasn't been checked out to say that it was done, that it's actually kosher. We just automatically, we can't assume that.
No,
I'm saying.
No, you have to have a hashgacha. Don't misunderstand.
Okay, so it still has a Jewish hashgacha. Okay.
Have to have absolutely, because again, Pas Akum today, you buy all these breads in the store and have the Chafkei or the OU on it. These are not Jewish companies. But the social interaction part of it doesn't exist anymore because it's not your next door neighbor who's baking the bread. So you can buy kosher bread with a hashgacha. But again, the statute technically is still on the books. Even though many people behave as if the Pas Akum takana or gezerah was lifted, we have no definitive proof in the Talmud that it was. The assumption that some Rishonim make is because Jews ate pasakum, therefore, at one time the gezerah must have been lifted. It's not so easy when it was, again, there were 18 gezeros that Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai issued together. That's unusual. And it's not so easy. We have a rule that if one Beis Din issues a decree, then no other Beis Din can annul that decree unless it's greater in number or in wisdom. And who's going to say they're wiser than Hillel and Shammai? It's a very slippery slope. But again, we run into the conflict of ein gozer gzeira al hatzibur emein hatzibur yachol lamed bo. If a decree was issued that people simply cannot follow or have difficulty following, like shemen akum, that was annulled by Yehuda Hanasi a few generations after Hillel and Shammai, because simply people couldn't abide by it. You need oil to cook, kosher oil, obviously. But pas akum, as I said, is still on the book. You will find people in some communities that are very makpid all year long, only to eat Jewish baked bread. And there are today a number of sources where you can get that. Jewish companies who are baking bread or bakery bread. But in terms of the structure of how halacha works, we have a lot of competing interests. The halacha wants people to be able to observe halacha. What happens when they find it to be too difficult? And who determines the level of difficulty? That's up in the air, and that depends on the poskim in your generation. Rav Moshe Feinstein, the great posek in the 20th century, allowed pasakum. He allowed, it was a heter. It doesn't mean you should, but it's permissible, but the decree is still on the books. It's one of the more fascinating halachos of contemporary Jewish life that many people may not be familiar with, but pas akum is still very observed in many, many places in the Jewish community, not just during Aseres Shemei Tshuva. Obviously, we're worried. Yeah, go ahead. Question.
I'm sorry. This might be like going off on a tangent because you're talking about bread, but restaurants, or for that matter, bakeries that are owned by Jews that are under some kind of, hashgacha, avad, or whatever, everyone working / cooking / baking in those establishments is not necessarily a Jew. So how does that filter through?
Excellent question. And the poskim deal with that in great detail. As long as a Jew is involved in the process at some point, that takes it out of the category of non-Jewish. So in bakeries and in restaurants, for example, the mashgiach turns on the ovens or turns on the gas. And in other ways, they might participate in the cooking process. You might have the owner come in and do something. But clearly, as long as there's a Jew involved in somewhere in the process, and in most cases it means turning on the ovens, that takes it out of the category of non-Jewish bread or non-Jewish cooking.
Thank you.
And that's however, be aware that this is a kula. It's a leniency. There are places where the bakery is all Jewish. Not too many, but in Muncie you'd have it, and in certain parts of Brooklyn you might have it. But I remember years ago, Rav Herschel Schechter was speaking in the shul, and they had just opened up the kosher Chinese restaurant next door to the shul. And I don't know what the context that it came up in, but he mentioned in the context of his speech that he doesn't understand how anybody can eat from a kosher Chinese restaurant. For that reason, because they're all non-Jews cooking in there. And Rabbi Yudin was turning all kinds of colors as Rabbi Schachter was saying it, because the RCBC had just given hashgacha. Again, it was owned by a non-Jew. Okay, now it's owned by a Jew. It's a different situation. But even then, even though it was owned by a non-Jew, the mashgiach did turn on the ovens. But it's a heter. It's a kula. It's a leniency. And the same can be said of almost every kosher restaurant. It's a leniency. I know of a number of very prominent rabbanim who won't eat in restaurants for that reason. They'll only eat in their house or someone else's house that they trust. They won't go out to eat in a restaurant because, unless it's an all Jewish restaurant, because turning on the ovens to be involved in the process to take it out of bishul akum or pas akum is a leniency, and they would rather not rely on a leniency. But in answer to your question, if a Jew participates, it takes it out of the category of non-Jew.
Thank you.
Any other question? Okay. I would say in almost 100% of the cases, the challah that you're going to have tonight is Jewish bread, for sure. But if you're looking for an extra stringency to adopt, pas akum could be one, especially as the Yom Neroim are coming up. It's one, again, it's putting all the different shitos together. It helps us try to understand a little bit better the halachic process. What the rabbis have the power to do, when they exercise this power, to what extent is the population's inability to follow a certain rule determinant in whether or not a rule stays on the books. These are all questions that are determined by our rabbis. Pas akum is in that in-between category. It's gray. On the one hand, to the best of our knowledge, that decree has not been lifted. On the other hand, it's sometimes very difficult to get Jewish baked bread. So if you can buy again, the heter is not, to make myself clear one more time, the heter is not on pas akum. The heter is on what they call pas palter. Non-Jewish bread is prohibited, but non-Jewish bread baked in a commercial establishment is permissible as long as it's kosher. That's the difference. So pas akum is still there. Pas palter, which is what we eat. Most of us eat pas palter. We go into a store, you buy a loaf of bread, it has a hashgacha on it. And that's pas palter. And since there's no question, you're not going to socialize with the foreman of the bakery, and God knows what state it's located in, and to go out with his daughter, there's no social interaction issue there. The question is, under what circumstances are decrees annulled based on people's inability to follow them, and who does the annulling? And this is still a question that's very much alive today in terms of the halachic process. Unfortunately, and this came up last week, or earlier this week, I think, we have no centralized authority to make rulings that affect all of Klal Yisrael. That we don't have until the Sanhedrin is reestablished. So we have to rely on each rabbinical authority in each location. But this is all part of the process. When is a decree annulled? Are all decrees capable of being annulled? Must you have a Sanhedrin to annul a decree? To what extent is popular behavior a determinant in what becomes an established halacha? These are all questions that apply in many, many areas, and from time to time, we may examine some of them. But pas akum, I thought, was a fascinating case study in one halacha, which is still on the books, even though it's mostly ignored by most segments of the Jewish community.
Wally?
Yes.
What about the bagel store?
Okay.
And not only is it pas akum and it's baked there, it's milchik as well.
Yeah. Yeah, that could be somewhat problematic. I don't know who turns on their ovens, but clearly it's pas akum. Although being that it's a commercial establishment, it would fall into the category of pas palter. And if the ingredients are all kosher, and there's no question about that, then that would be less of a problem. Obviously, it has a hashgacha, and people accept that hashgacha. Whether they should accept it, whether it's the optimal way to do it, that is open to debate. Clearly, it would be preferable if a Jew would turn on the ovens in the morning, but that's what in the category of pas palter. If all the ingredients are certified as kosher, then it takes it out of the category of pas akum and it becomes pas palter. In terms of bishul akum, that still might be a problem, and you have a very good point there. And I would ask that question of your local Orthodox rabbi. But it clearly becomes pas palter. Nobody is going to socialize with the people who are baking the bagels. It's a commercial establishment, and it's not your next door neighbor. So that would take it out of the pas akum category and put it into pas palter. The bishul akum aspect of it is a separate issue that has to be dealt with. And maybe at some point we can go into bishul akum, which is a very, very convoluted topic because most of it is based on different heterim. And in normative halacha, we try not to always look for heterim, but sometimes you have no choice. If it's going to avoid people committing more serious offenses, then we rely on certain heterim. And clearly, as was mentioned before, all the restaurants and all the bakeries, these are all, in most cases, non-Jewish people doing the actual work. And we rely on heterim for us to eat it. Otherwise, the hashgacha businesses would go out of business. Because, what would happen if you stopped giving hashgacha? Would people stop buying the bagels? I'll end with this because it's a very tricky question. A number of years ago, on South River Road, there's a place called Harold's Farm. It's a lovely, lovely farm, and they grew their own vegetables. Now it's where the Bottle King is. There used to be a working farm, delicious fruits and vegetables, wonderful, wonderful place, and people went there for fruits and vegetables. The best place in town to go. And then at one point, they bought a donut machine to make donuts. And since many people who are frum go there, they asked the rabbi, can we eat those donuts? There was nothing in them that was in it. So Rabbi Yudin went over at the time, and he spoke with Harold, and they were sof kol sof. The ingredients were 100% kosher, and that's all they did. They just made the bagels there. But the RCBC wasn't happy with it. So for a long time, until they sold Harold's Farm, the fruits and vegetables were fine. The donut machine was under Rabbi Yudin's private hashgacha. And that was the only place in Fairlawn that had Rabbi Yudin's private hashgacha. Before there was an RCBC, he gave the hashgacha on what became Zady's. 2 owners before Zady. They were open on Shabbos, but people were going there. It was the only bakery in town. It was kosher. The fact that the owner of the bakery belonged to our shul is a separate issue. But before there was an RCBC, he gave a hashgacha on it, even though it was open on Shabbos.
Wow.
Rabbi Wally.
Yes.
Another question. Sorry. Go back to the very beginning. So try to compare or set up some parallel between pas akum and mevushal.
Well, the bishul akum and pas akum have a lot of things in common. The whole business of turning on the ovens technically takes it out of the category of bishul akum. But it's a heter. It's a leniency. If you could find Jewish Chinese people to cook, that would certainly be better. You can't find them.
But when I say mevushal, I'm talking about wine.
Oh, wine? No. So any wine, The wine that was brought on the Mizbeach was not mavushal. So the non-Jewish wine issue has more to do with what was originally used in the Beis Hamikdash. In the Beis Hamikdash, they use the better wines are not mavushal. They're not boiled. They're not pasteurized. So technically, if it's mavushal, a non-Jew can handle it. Technically, and that's why at weddings they always serve mavushal wine when there are non-Jewish waiters going around. But theoretically, you're right. Theoretically, all wine should be handled by Jews. But the technicality is that on the Mizbeach, they only use non-mavushal wines in the Beis Hamikdash, and therefore that's the only place where a non-Jew can't touch it. Other than that, if it's mavushal, it takes it out of that category the same way that turning on the ovens takes it out of bishul akum. So bishul akum relies on one heter, and yayin akum on another heter. But we're relying on heterim. And when you rely on a heter, normally in the halakhic structure, a heter is something that you rely on b'di'evid, after the fact, not l'chatchila. In the best, sometimes you have to rely on heterim, but starting off the bat, you should not. It's preferable not to. But again, the reality is we do rely on them. So that's the practical aspect of the halakhic system, and that's why mashgichim and hashgacha organizations are in business. They have to know which heter to apply when. Otherwise our diet will be very limited. Anything else? Okay, have a wonderful Shabbos. Enjoy your Jewish challah tonight.
Thank you.
Schwarz is eine Yid. Wally.
Yes.
All right, good.
Noch schwer sein a from me.
What?
Tzaddik, right? This is eine tzaddik.
Wally,
Yeah.
I just thought of something. What happens if you said that if your next door neighbor is a guy and he's baking, you can't rely on that,
Yes.
right? That's us. What happens if your next door neighbor is Jewish but is not from at all?
Okay. So what? As long as the food is kosher. As long as the food is reliably kosher, you can eat it.
So there